In this video, we are actually going to work through part 1 of assignment 7B, completing what I work through in this video will guarantee you 60% on your assignment. So it pretty much guarantees you a passing grade. It does not guarantee you an A. You will have to solve the rest of the assignment on your own. But because I've actually been kind of pressed for time lately, creating videos for this class, or lecture videos, has been actually pretty challenging, if not impossible, over the past few weeks. So I gave this a little bit of thought, and considering the fact that we're talking about Ajax this week and using the Fetch API, I actually had to find a way, or at least wanted to find a way, to illustrate these topics in a way that made it accessible and didn't set you guys up for a lot of frustration and failure. So what I did with this week is I decided, well, hey, why don't I solve part of this problem for you and then let you solve the rest of it on your own. And so as opposed to a lengthy series of lectures, we will go through the first part of 7A and the first part of 7B and the second part of 7B together as two separate videos, and you will see the framework that you'll need to complete the rest of the problem yourself. So this will give you a working solution that you then need to add to, and it will give you a basic template, if you will, to implement subsequent fetch or calls to the Fetch API to solve the rest of the problem. In any event, this guarantees you will have a successful assignment 7B part 1 and assignment 7B part 2. None of you should actually fail this assignment. Now, you may all come out with D's, 60%, but none of you will fail this because of the way I set it up. So it's just a little bit of a different way of trying to think of this problem, given my time constraints and my desire to create something that you can see and hear, which for me is a very effective way of learning. So we are going to look at part 1 of assignment B first. Part 1 is actually going to use the Fetch API to work with an XML document. Part 2 will use the Fetch API to work with a JSON object. Now, XML is an old format. It was developed in the, I want to say the late 90s, maybe around 98, maybe it was around a little sooner. It is a heavy format, and I say it's heavy because XML repeats tags. And so if you think about HTML, XML looks very similar to HTML in that you can have opening and closing tags, right? So you get that coming down with your document. And so having that duplicate data does make XML what I term to be heavier. It's just larger data. Now, if you want lightweight data transmission, you would look at something like JSON, which doesn't have that repeated data in it. XML has been around a long time, and there are, despite the fact that XML is a heavier format, there are some advantages in 2019 to using XML. XML documents can be validated against schemata. So an XML schema is going to say that an XML document of a given type will look like something, and when you get XML data, if it complies with a specific schema, then you can compare that data to the schema, and if the data doesn't comply with that schema, then that data is not good. So there's a validation built into XML by its very nature, and so it's valuable for things like, I would consider, if you're doing machine-to-machine interactions, you'd want to make sure that that data coming across is good, and you'd use that validation. And so you will still see XML. You'll see it because it's been around a long time, 20 plus years. You'll see it because it's still used in some technologies. If you use a term or you come across a term SOAP, which stands for, I should have looked this up before I mentioned it. SOAP. Really? Oh, come on, Wikipedia. Okay, so we've got the saponifying SOAP, but I want, here we go, Simple Object Access Protocol. And so you can create a SOAP envelope and you can actually send data using XML. Older way of exchanging data between machines, but it's out there and it's still very much used. So you will run into XML probably in your career. So we are going to look at that in a simple use case. Now, what we're going to do in part 1 of assignment 7B is we're actually going to just retrieve the weather. I have a weather reading right now for Epley Airfield here in Omaha, Nebraska, and you'll see that I have the date, I have a little image, I have the current temperature, which actually isn't as cold as it felt when I took the dogs out, 43 degrees Fahrenheit on this sunny 13th of October 2019. This looks like an HTML document, but if I right-click on it and I click View Page Source, you'll see it's actually an XML document. That's what I'm actually getting from this URL here. More than likely, it's going through what's known as an XML transform. There's an XML style sheet applied to this, so it goes to so it gets converted to this page here by going through that XML transform. And now that I'm looking at this, we have a style sheet associated with this. So XML transform is just a way of taking an XML document and turning it into something like this without a lot of effort. The style sheet is just applied to it. So it's out there. What we're actually pulling looks like a regular web page, but it's not. It's just a styled XML document. So looking at this XML document, you'll see that there's repetition. I've got data in here, but it is duplicated. And so that actually increases the size of this document, which is why I say that this is a heavy format. Looking at this, we have some style or some schemata that this complies with. And so that's what allows us to validate that this document is actually a valid XML document and contains valid data. The way this page works is I can replace this value here that I have highlighted with a 3-letter code for a different city or airport. So OMA is the 3-letter code for Epley Airfield. If I wanted to check the weather conditions in Kansas City, actually north of Kansas City at Kansas City International, I would replace that OMA with MCI, which stands for, I think it's Mid-Continent International, which was the original name of Kansas City International Airport. And you'll see that that pulls up Kansas City International Airport. It's a little bit warmer in Kansas City. It's about 8 degrees warmer in Kansas City. If I pull up KLAX, I will see that it's a little bit warmer in Los Angeles right now. It's about 62 degrees. But nevertheless, the key to selecting the city lies in these 3 letters here. So just kind of keep that in mind because it will come into play here very shortly. So let's look at the requirements for part 1, or rather step 1 of part 1. The first thing we are directed to do is to write a bunch of helper functions. Now, what we're not told to do is we're not told to write an event handler for the load event for the page, or for the window, excuse me. And we know that that's going to be an issue, so we're just going to create that event listener so we don't have to go back and do it later. And I can use the anonymous function syntax like that, which I'm just a creature of habit. I do that, or we can use the arrow functions. Whichever you prefer is fine with me. I try to use the arrow functions a little bit more these days, but I sometimes forget. So we have that there. And what we're told to do is write a number of helper functions. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put down here a comment helper functions. And the reason I put in a bunch of carriage returns is I just want my helper functions at the bottom. They don't necessarily need to be there. It's just something I'm choosing to do. And so my first helper function is called display loading, and it will accept 2 parameters. The first parameter is a string representing the side to display the information. So I'm just going to call that side. And the second parameter is a string representing the text to display while information is loading. So I'm just going to call that loading text. It's a very creative name there. And I'm just going to leave that stub for now, and I will come back to 1B in just a minute because I'm going to read through the rest of the requirements. Or rather, come back to 1A. 1B asks me to create a function named clear loading. So function named clear loading, which accepts 0 parameters. So I will just create that as a stub right there. And I'll jump to 1C, a function named check airport code. So we'll create that there. Accept 0 parameters. We'll create that little stub there. And a function named display data, which accepts a single parameter representing a string that needs to be converted to XML and parsed. So I'm just going to call my parameter XML and leave my stub right there. Now, let's see here. I'm going to go back to step 1, 1A, and take a look at display loading. So we've got the first and second parameter spelled out as required. And our other requirements is that the function should verify that left or right is passed to it. So we will say if side does not equal left and side does not equal right. Let me see. The function should verify that left or right are passed to it. I'm going to throw an error if something else is. If it's invalid. And the text will be display loading accepts right and left only. Okay, if the second parameter is missing, the function should set the default value of loading text to loading content. And so now let's go ahead and check loading text. Whoops, sorry. If loading text. Remember, a variable is always going to have a value in JavaScript. It's either going to have something or undefined. So if it doesn't contain that something, which could be anything, it is going to be undefined. So if I never pass the second parameter, I'll know that loading text is actually undefined. And so if loading text is undefined, I'm just going to set loading text equal to loading content 1, 2, 3, just as required right there. All right, so let's see if the input is good. The function should. So actually there's an else. And I'm just going to swap the order of this, even though it's in a different order in the requirements, just because I'm going to put this else in here. Just kind of makes sense to do that. Let's see if the function is good. If the input is good, the function should create a paragraph element containing the HTML with the loading text. The paragraph should get appended to the side passed as the first parameter. So what I'm going to need to do is I'm going to have to create a reference to this side. So I'm going to let's just call it side. Well, actually, let's do this. Let's create a variable called loading text container. And that is going to be, that's going to hold that new paragraph tag. Whoops. Paragraph tag right there. And let's see. With the loading text, the paragraph should get appended to the side of the first parameter. So loading text container inner HTML is going to be equal to loading text. And then it's going to be appended to the side, passed as the first parameter. So what I need is a reference to that side. I'm actually going to create that up here since I'm probably going to use that. Yeah, I'm going to use that for more than once. I'll just create it before that. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to let, I'm going to call this container. Actually, it's probably a const container, and it's going to be equal to my ID, and it's going to be the side that I'm working with. Okay. And so loading text container.append child loading text container. So I'm going to append that right there. And then for step 1.1a52, create an empty div element with the associated classes of loading and centered. The div should get appended to the side past the first parameter. So I'm going to create loading image container, and that is going to be equal to a new div, and loading image container will be associated with the classes, whoops, class list, loading, and I'm just going to copy that, replace loading with centered, and then I'm going to append that to that container reference that I have there. Now, before I press on, it's important to note that when I invoke this function, if I don't pass in the side in the right, in the same, we're using the same case as the ID was defined in index.html, then I will not be able to actually, I will not get a reference to it when I execute this. So in HTML, your IDs are case sensitive. It's important to note that. And so if we wanted, we could potentially add a little bit more logic to this to check to see that we were actually working, like let's say I defined it as uppercase in my HTML document, I'm working with it lowercase here. We could actually add logic to check to make sure that we actually obtained a reference to that container. And then if we didn't, we could throw an error. We're not going to do that here, but it is just important to note that the IDs in the HTML document are case sensitive. IDs in a CSS file, or CSS is not case sensitive. So the IDs, it's just a funny difference between the different languages and environments, but it is something that you should know. Okay, so we've got that there. That should satisfy 1A cool, so that'll be there. And yeah, we'll just, for the readability, I'll just do that. Kind of want to move these, but I'm not going to. Okay, so we've got that. Clear loading, which accepts 0 parameters and which clears the content of the div with the ID value right. And so we'll just do this. Actually, no. Let's see. Document.get element by ID. Right. You know, let's do this. That way we only have to look for this one time, and then we'll store the reference. So we won't do that. And then we could just do this. Now we're going to reference that const. And we'll just set the inner HTML to an empty string. That's really all that we need to do to clear that right side. Okay. So check airport code, which accepts 0 parameters and checks the airport code. So looking at our HTML document, our airport code will be stored in this ID right here, which I'm going to copy. And I'm going to go back to my JavaScript, and I'm going to create a reference to that, a const. That way I don't have to call this verbose method all the time. And it keeps me from having to search the DOM. Or search the document. So we've got that. So airport code, which accepts 0 parameters and checks the airport code. So a function will return a Boolean value if the airport is empty or greater than 3 characters in length, return false, otherwise return true. So let's go ahead and get the value. I'm just going to create a const here. Airport code value. And you don't have to do this. You could actually just use airport code.value in every single case. If you wanted to type more text than necessary, value, Visual Studio Code fighting me here. Okay, we'll do that. Thank you. All right, and so if code value is an empty string, return false. If airport code value dot length is greater than 3, return false, return true. And this is just fairly concise code The reason that this all can work is that when I enter check airport code, if airport code value is an empty string, I'm going to return false, and I'm going to exit the function. I won't execute any other code. If this is not an empty string, then I go down here, and if the length of the string is greater than 3 characters, then I return false, and I don't execute any other code. It just immediately exits the check airport code function and returns the Boolean value false. If I don't have a blank string, and if my string length is equal to or less than 3, then I'm just going to return true. So it is a very concise way of writing this code. I don't have to have else's or anything like that. It just keeps things nice and clear. But that's what's going on here, and because it's not so verbose, it may not be readily apparent why it was written this way. I really don't have to write too much more to get what I'm looking at within the context of this right here. All right, so step 1, 1D, function name display data, which is going to accept a single parameter representing a string that needs to be converted to XML and parsed. The function should parse the string into an XML document and extract the values. Okay, so I'm going to just sit on that. We're probably going to come back here in just a second, because I really don't know what my XML document looks like. I know what it looks like right here, and I know that it's looking for the value stored here. I'm sorry, not here. Where am I? Here, which that's location, and I know that it's looking for temp underscore F, which is right here. Okay, but I'm not actually sure what I'm going to get in terms of the actual what's actually going to show up in my browser. So let's go ahead and move to step 1, part 2. When the user clicks on the anchor tag with the ID value of action get weather. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a reference to action get weather. So when the user clicks on that, we're going to do something. All right, so the check the value stored in the input with the value airport code is valid by invoking the check airport code function and checking the return value. A return value true will indicate your script should proceed if the return value is true. So we won't proceed if it is false. So if check airport code, and we don't have an else. So if this is right now, if this is not valid, we're not throwing any errors or anything like that. But if it was invalid, that's when we'd have the else, and we'd put our error here, right? If there were that error condition, or we do something else in that case. But we haven't been directed to do that. So if the return value is false, display a loading message by invoking the display loading function, passing the appropriate values to display loading content in the div with the ID value. Right, so display loading, and we're going to pass right to that. I'm just going to stop there and see if we have enough code to actually take a look at this. I'm going to pull up part 1 here, and I'm going to actually open my browser tools because I want to see what's going on. And I'm going to click get weather. Nothing happens. I'm going to put in OMA, click get weather, and loading content appears. So that is right here, line 8, loading content right. It appears I have an error in my paths, which we'll take a look at here in just a minute. So down here, I see that when I created these starter files for you, I accidentally did not put my path together correctly. And so in my CSS, let's see here, down here in loading images, that probably should have had 2 dots. Let's go ahead and reload that. Check that here. Get weather. Cool. And so now my little Ajax loader graphic is showing up right there. I fixed my path there. And you'll have to do the same because you're getting the same exact code that I'm starting with You're seeing all my errors. And I hope I'm not going to edit this video any more than I need to. I hope by showing you these errors and the way that I'm working through this, it can help you develop or see the way that I see how to break down a problem. Not that how I do it is gospel, don't take it that way. But if we haven't worked with JavaScript before, if this is our first foray into building slightly larger solutions, it just gives you a basis to start developing your own methodology for solving these problems. That's really why I say that. Okay, so we've gotten to this point here. Display loading right, cool. Use the fetch API to retrieve the current weather from the following URL, which I gave you in the write-up. So that's this one here. Now the URL I gave you is actually this. And those 3 hashtags or pound signs or number symbols that you see there represent the 3-letter city code like OMA, LAX, etc. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a const to hold the URL. And what I really want is I really want just this section of the URL right here up to the K. Okay. And so I need to append that 3-letter code to the end of that string. And so what I will do is I will just do this airport code dot value. And so that should give me KOMA. And let's make sure that's working by just outputting that URL here. And let's see what happens in our window here. I put in OMA, I click get weather, and what is my URL? It appends OMA just like I wanted to append. So that is working right there. Just get rid of that right there. All right, cool. So we need to fetch that URL or use the fetch API to retrieve the current weather. So that's it right there. Now that's going to create a promise. So we need to use the then clause, and we're going to get our response. And what we need to do is when the promise is resolved, check the response was successful. If so, return it, otherwise throw an error. So I need to check that the response was successful, and I can do that by checking the OK property of the response object. And if it was good, I'm going to return the response, and that'll kick off, or I'll have to have another then clause to handle that. Otherwise, if it wasn't successful, I'm going to throw a new error, and I'll just, let's see, my error should response status text. So I'm going to just get the status text property, or read or return the status text property from that response object. Okay, now real quickly, what's going on here is I have an if without an else. And it is a more concise way of writing this. I really don't need to put this else here. And the reason I don't have to do that is because of this return right here. So if the response is okay, that return is going to return that response, and it's immediately going to exit out of the body of this function right here, this arrow function. So I don't have to have the else, because either this is going to return if the response is okay, or if this is false, it's immediately going to throw an error. So it is a more concise way of writing something like this. This is more verbose. It tells you exactly what's going on, but it has essentially the same effect as this. And that's because, again, a return will immediately exit the body of the function. So nothing, if I had a console.log here, nothing after that return statement will execute. So I'm either going to exit immediately right here, or I'm just going to throw that error depending on the value stored in the OK property of that response object. Okay, so I'm returning that response. I need to handle the promise again, or in another way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have another then, and as opposed to having an arrow function with a body, I'm going to define what I'm working with, and I'm going to call it response again. And because my arrow function isn't going to have a body, I don't have to surround this response with parents. Okay, let's take a look at this. I'm just going to execute the text method. on the response object. So that's going to create another promise, which we'll handle here in just a second. But I can write this like this, right? If I were going to do more than one thing, I could write that arrow function like that. But because all I'm going to do is invoke the text method of the response object, I can write my code a little bit more concisely like that. Okay, so if it is confusing, just be more verbose and write things out as you need to understand them. Even if you have to do something like this, which is an equivalent for an anonymous function to handle that, I'm just trying to keep more closely aligned with what is in your textbook. Okay, so we have that arrow function there. That text method is going to create another promise, so we need to handle that promise. We got a lot of thens, then. Okay, now, whoops. Then I'm going to call this object, in this case, text. And all I'm going to do is pass this to the display text function I defined earlier. Okay, so this is the response I'm getting back from the server. I check it and then I return it and it comes back here. I call it response again when I work with it here to convert things to text, and then it gets passed back here, and in this instance that same piece of data now takes on the name of text. Okay, so it's just kind of getting passed through all these thens. I could have used response again if that would have made it a little bit easier to understand what's going on. The reason I called it text here is now this response has been read and the body of the response, because the response contains a lot of properties. The one property, the body of the response, is all I really care about. It has been converted to text, and so now that's all that's getting passed. It's no longer that response object. It is a piece of data out of it, and it represents text, okay? Because that's what was returned by this method here. So that's why I chose to call it text. If it's easier to remember what's going on, to just call the object the same thing, then so be it. But it is the same piece of data kind of getting chained down this tree, if you want to think of it that way. All right, so I have that there. And finally, I do have a throw right here. And so I have to account for the fact that that actually could throw an error. So I'll just need to catch that error. And because I only have one line of text I'm going to put here, I'm just going to do one of these truncated arrow functions. I'm just going to display the error to my console. We'll do that right there. All right. So with everything all said and done, let's go ahead and try this and see what happens. Okay, display text is not defined. Oh. What did I do? Oh, that's because my function is called display data. There we go, display data. Do that, OMA. And I hope you see the value of having this console window open as you're developing. Get weather, cool, that's working there. So let's see. What I'm going to do down here is let's see what we're getting back from the server. Let's make sure that this is actually firing. Get weather. Hot dog. You guys remember that old movie, It's a Wonderful Life? Yeehaw. Hot dog, I think is what he said. So we're actually, all of this is working. Cool. We're getting back this XML data from the National Weather Service. We're getting back this data right here, this data that I showed earlier. So we can retrieve the weather. And maybe I don't believe what's going on. I'm going to clear this up, and I'm going to change this to MCI, and we'll see what's going on 200 miles south of us. And I get the weather, or at least I get the XML document representing the weather data for Kansas City International Airport, down just south of us. If I still don't believe it, I'm going to change that to LNK. And now I get the information for Lincoln Municipal Airport, 50 miles to the west of us. Woohoo! So things are going good. I know I can get that data. I've got some other things going on here that I need to resolve, because you see I have all these loading contents going on. We'll fix that here in a bit. But we have that working, and that's great. So let's go back and look at part 1, step 1.d. So In display data, we need to parse this. We can't work with this because this is just a string. We can display the information here, but it would just display as this string. So we have to actually convert this string into an XML document so that we can work with it in different ways. Otherwise, it's going to be a bear to extract this data. Let's just do write like this. And I reload this, and I'm going to put LNK. We'll make this a little bit smaller here. Get weather. And you see that it just dumps everything here. Now I can't just do XML.location. We'll do that here real quickly. And we'll do Lincoln Municipal Airport again. When I do that, it's undefined. And that's just because that XML document is not a document. This right here is just a string. Now, if I wanted to, I could brute force it and try to iterate through all that stuff and extract the data. That's too much work. There are actually methods built into the DOM API that'll make this a lot easier. We just have to convert this document into the right format. And so to do that, what we'll have to do is we'll have to create an instance of a DOM parser. And so I'm going to create a variable called parser, and I'll set it equal to a new instance of DOM parser. All right, now with that DOM parser, I can actually parse that string into an XML document. And so I'll create a new variable called XML doc. And what I will do is I will invoke the parse from string method of the parser object. And so I'm going to pass in this data, this string data right now, and I'm going to parse it as text XML. This right here is what's known as a MIME type. Okay, I don't mean MIME like the guy that or gal that stands in whiteface and pulls an invisible string. MIME actually stands for like multi-part information, multi-purpose internet mail extensions. So it specifies data types as I pass data along the internet. And most of the time we don't see these MIME types, but when we send emails, when we actually load data off the internet, this type of information is getting sent in the headers of the requests. And so MIME types will help to display images, videos, XML documents, JSON documents, etc. Your server has to be configured to serve MIME types. If it isn't, then you can have some problems. But that's what this is. That is a MIME type, M-I-M-E. All right, so that should create an XML document. And when we do that, if we go and we do console.log, and now we output our XML document, you'll see that it's slightly different than what we saw just a few minutes ago. Let's go here, get weather. And when we do this, instead of a string of data being displayed in our document, what we have now is something that can actually be navigated. It is an XML document. And with that in mind, we can work with it in a similar fashion to how we can work with an HTML document using those DOM API methods. So what I want to do is I actually want to get the data stored. Where am I? Stored in this element here, and the data stored in, where are you? This element here. All right. None of these elements have an ID attribute as we'd have in an HTML document. So if we look here, our elements have IDs. So we can't use something like document.getElement by ID or XML.getElement by ID to retrieve any of these pieces of information. The only real method that we have to work with this document is the getElementsByTagName method. So we can use that to actually select information by tag name. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to create a variable called location. I'm going to set it equal to the return value of xml.getElementsByTagName. Now, it is important to remember that getElementsByTagName will never return a single value. It will always return a collection. Think of a collection as an array. So if I attempt to do something like this, enter HTML, let's see what we get when we attempt to display that location information. OMA, get weather. Whoops, I should probably do this. Okay. Let's go ahead and do that. Get weather. And so we get undefined. Okay, we're gonna get a collection back, and let me make sure that is correct. Anyway, okay, yeah. So we're getting back a collection. There is no inner HTML of the collection. Okay, if we get rid of this property or this attempt to access this property here, let's do this. And so we see as HTML collection. Okay, so if we think of a collection as an array, we have to actually reference a specific element of the array. And so if we do that, we can now get that piece of information. Okay, I'm actually going to leave this here so we can continue to see that document. So we have that there. Fortunately, there is only one location element in this document. If there were multiple ones, like let's say location, 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 we would have to know which specific element we were looking at. With most of this document, at least looking at it right now, each of these elements is unique. So tag name sub-0 should give us the specific piece of information we're looking for, which makes things a little bit easy for us if it's even though it's a little bit clunky on that side. So with that knowledge in mind, let's go ahead and get the temperature. I want that. I know I want the first element of that, and I want inner HTML. And then let's go ahead and create a string. WX is just shorthand for weather. So I'm going to say the current temperature in, and so we're going to is Fahrenheit. Okay, so we'll just do that, and then we'll just replace this here, and we'll save that. We'll see what that looks like. Whoops, OAM. And we have that right there. The current temperature in Omaha Epley Airfield is 48.0 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, so we've got that all right there. And this basic code will satisfy your 60% pass. You've got a passing grade. Now, to get that A, there's going to be a little bit more that you'll have to do. But what I do want you to note is that you have the basics of this fetch API and the basics of how to parse a response to a specific data type. In this case, we're parsing our response as text data. Recall, you can parse the response as, or the body of the response as JSON. If you're getting back JSON data, you can parse it as a blob. If you're getting back some sort of binary data, for example, if you're retrieving an image, it's going to come back as a blob. But this template, if you will, is all defined for you. You will have to use more of these fetches to solve additional levels of the assignment. But again, in my estimation, probably the hardest part of getting one's head wrapped around this is hopefully solved for you. And now you can start using this to stretch yourselves a little bit. Again, with this, I also want to underscore the fact that this video isn't going to get a lot of editing. You're going to see my own mistakes. I am not perfect. I'm your instructor, but that doesn't mean I'm all-knowing sage. I just have a little bit more experience than you. But the important thing to note is that I am your instructor, but I'm a person, I'm a human, and I make mistakes as well. And I want you to see that not only do I make mistakes, but I want you to see me making those mistakes in this particular exercise so you can see that, at least get an estimation of how I find my own mistakes and how I work through trying to solve my mistakes and or my problems. Again, talking about what I talked about earlier, or repeating what I talked about earlier, is if you don't have a lot of experience, whether it be working with JavaScript or coding in any form, these are some of the harder skills to develop. How do you find problems? How do you troubleshoot issues? How do you start working through more abstract data? Because with this in particular, as we start working with the Fetch API, you don't necessarily see the interaction happening. It's happening behind the scenes. And so the number of tools that you have available to you start to be limited. You don't have these visual indicators anymore. They're here, but they're in these developer tools. And we have to get familiar with working with them, looking at data in a little bit of different ways and figuring out how we can actually take the data we're getting back and put it into a usable or displayable piece of information as we have right here.